All right, so here's something that's really interesting. Now, this is an article from the Washington Examiner. Now, it is about Dave Rubin, and the author of said article, his name is Christian Barnard. This article is titled "I stopped watching the Rubin Report, and you should too." Now, this is actually interesting, and I'll tell you why. First of all, so on the website mediabiasfactcheck.com, which they tell you the media bias of each site, it says that this one has a right bias. The funded by slash ownership says the Washington Examiner is owned by Clarity Media Group, which is in turn owned by Philip Anschutz, who is an American billionaire entrepreneur who describes himself as a, quote, conservative Christian. Anschutz is also the owner of the right-leaning Weekly Standard and has donated millions of dollars to right-leaning causes, including anti-LGBT groups such as the Family Research Council, which has been labeled a hate group. The Washington Examiner is funded through an advertising and subscription model. So, and in the analysis, it says it is basically, different version of the Hill with the right-leaning tilt, is what it says. So that is what makes this actually interesting, is that it is what is definitely a right-wing website. I can't 100% be sure about this guy Christian, whether or not he's conservative. However, I will definitely say that it seems like it, but I don't know. So he was on point for a while until I finally had my first objection. Now, I'm going to read this to you guys, this whole article, because I think it's important. It's going to take a bit, but he starts out saying the so-called intellectual dark web is having a cultural moment by casting aside political correctness and embracing taboo topics like free speech and identity politics. The ideologically diverse group has attracted controversy and high praise. Popular members include clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson, neuroscientist Sam Harris, right-wing pundit Ben Shapiro, and media personality Dave Rubin. That's a funny way of putting Dave Rubin, by the way, which is pretty true. He's a careerist. It says all around North America and Europe, they're routinely selling out large auditoriums of adoring fans. At the heart of the group is Rubin, who is largely responsible for wrangling up the dark web crew to begin with. Prior to associating with one another, most intellectual dark web characters were first Rubin Report guests. He originally booked most of them in response to controversies where they had been shouted down by protesters or unfairly criticized by the left. Rubin's show has grown significantly since it started in 2015, boasting nearly 800,000 subscribers and 170 million total views to date. I've been a loyal fan, and I've learned a lot from his videos, but I recently had to hit the unsubscribe button. He says, during the latter years of my undergraduate education in 2016 and 2017, I became deeply concerned with the free speech controversies cropping up at university campuses across the country. This may be an early devotee of Rubin. He featured an interesting range of guests, all whom shared my frustration with intolerant college students and the generally querulous political climate. Never heard that word. His conversations frequently covered campus controversies, media censorship, the importance of free expression, and the tendency of some progressives to mislabel those they disagree with as racist or Nazis. To their credit, Rubin and his intellectual dark web comrades are an eclectic mix. Among their ranks are left and right-leaning academics Brett Weinstein and Jordan Peterson, respectively, a quote never Trump conservative pundit Ben Shapiro, and several contrarian feminists Christina Hoff Sommers and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. But although they are right in their assessment of toxic political correctness and the, quote, regressive left, a term describing authoritarian progressives, the intellectual dark web has hardly presented a solution. As the group's uniting voice, Rubin has played a unique role in defining how the conversations between intellectual dark web members play out, and therein lies the problem. So this is where the objections really start rolling in after all the preface. This objection, I think, is very good. This is actually a sort of complaint that Kyle Kalinske actually had about Dave Rubin was, what are your ideas? Like, what ideas do you have? You talk about having these ideas, and you don't really provide anything outside of just having these quote-unquote conversations. it goes on saying Rubin is a notoriously non-confrontational host. One would be hard-pressed to find a single interview where he firmly challenges anything his guests say. I used to think this style was a refreshing shift from mainstream media shouting, perhaps a conscious move toward free and open dialogue, but now I'm not so sure. In a March 2017 interview with conservative author David Horowitz, Rubin was happy to let his interviewee call Democrats a, quote, racist party who had been infiltrated by totalitarians. Even when Horowitz called former President Barack Obama a communist, he still went unchallenged. Similarly, in an October 2015 discussion with right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos, Rubin said nothing as his guest insulted feminists and thanked God for the patriarchy. Statements like these warrant some kind of pushback, and it is hardly a celebration of free speech to resign oneself to smiling and nodding. This is this criticism right here, I think, is most measured. I think that it is very well put. I think that it's very well detailed, and I think that it is completely on point. So I think that this example has been used a lot now because I think that it's like the epitome, essentially, of what we're talking about here, which is the example of David Horowitz. Because, you know, I think Dave Rubin's mantra was supposed to be like, you know, give them enough rope to hangers just to hang themselves. And despite David Horowitz claiming that Barack Obama was a communist, which is insanity because communism, you know, Barack Obama literally, Obamacare, the fucking plan that is nicknamed by him, that plan mandates purchase through private insurance companies. And if you know anything about communism, the private sector does not exist in communism. And so you would think that somebody whose administration has seen massive gains in the stock market, which is private sector, massive private sector gains, massive job private sector gains, massive, as I just said, Obamacare, which is private insurance mandating private insurance purchase. So the idea of actually claiming that Barack Obama is a communist should be something that essentially disqualifies you from being a serious person in anybody's mind whatsoever. Because if you honestly think that, you are clearly a level of stupid that cannot be matched. And with the Milo thing, thank God for the patriarchy. That's an insane comment too. I actually hadn't heard that one, but Milo Yiannopoulos is more of a troll, so I don't really care about him or what he has to say because he's a troll. David Horowitz was supposed to be a serious person, but Milo Yiannopoulos I already know is a fucking troll, so I don't take him seriously. But this article goes on. It says Rubin has made more than his fair share of reputation-tarnishing misjudgments. His show has featured Stefan Molyneux, a Canadian alt-right pundit with an indefensible fascination with race and IQ, and Mike Cernovich, a conspiracy theorist in the mold of Alex Jones. It says, I remember watching these interviews with an open mind, only to be horrified when I Googled guest names afterward. Long before either appeared on Rubin's show in 2016-2017, Molyneux and Cernovich were well known as slimy conspiracy theorists, and yet Rubin still chose to give them a massive platform. So this is actually another, I would say, valid criticism, which is providing people who are undeserving of a platform, especially one that is as big as his, because the truth is that Dave Rubin's platform is very large. It is in no doubt very large. And so when you start giving credence to these ideas of race realism, which is just racism, it's just a different term, because if you say racism, you're automatically not looked as serious in any rational person's mind. But if you are somebody who says race realism, that's sort of getting it's the common tactic, where it's the death tax versus the estate tax, and it's torture versus enhanced interrogation. It's a very common, cheap, very, very cheap tactic. Now, here's where it gets bad. It went from being good to no objections to terrible. So it says, all things considered, Rubin has still taken an unfair beating from his left-wing critics. He is frequently mischaracterized as far-right. I don't think he's far-right, by the way. A coke sellout and a clueless fraud by progressive media outlets like Mother Jones and the Young Turks. He is a clueless fraud. He is definitely a coke sellout. I don't understand how people can't understand this. Like, he admitted it himself. The dumb fuck admitted it himself. He said that Learn Liberty sponsors an episode per month, and he said that they provided him a list of guests, and he booked multiple guests from that list. So he definitely sold out. He changed his ideology because he saw the opportunity to make more money on the right. It's not that complicated. It doesn't take. This is not E equals MC squared, which might actually be basic in physics. I'm not actually sure, but it goes on saying his college visits. I was about to say physics. His college visits have attracted protesters who ignorantly accuse him of peddling hate speech, supporting Nazis. There's not that many people who say he supports Nazis, by the way. He goes on to say some other stupid stuff too. He says, but I've also realized that Rubin wildly misses the mark in his understanding of free speech. I too am a staunch defender of free speech. I defend it not just as a constitutional right, but as one of the highest virtues. But there is no virtue in uncritically legitimizing silly ideas on a platform as influential as the Rubin Report. Rubin is a self-described emulator of Larry King, the media titan who dominated nighttime news for decades. King was famous for asking open-ended questions and allowing his guests to speak. On different occasions, Rubin has called King his mentor. Nevertheless, Rubin's interview style is far from King's. As a CNN host, King strove to leave his opinions at the door, while Rubin starts each interview with the direct address of his own opinions. King made his guests uncomfortable, while Rubin walks back any perceived challenges for the comfort of his guests. King highlights disagreements, while Rubin avoids it at all costs. The core problem with Rubin is that he has contented himself to only celebrating free speech as an end in and of itself. He seems to like it when guests say things just because they can, and while it is great that free citizens can say almost anything they want, stopping there misses much of what makes free speech so valuable. Virtuous free expression requires confrontation, not passive reception from a comfy red chair. So, that is actually true as well. There's a YouTube channel out there on YouTube that is called Counter Arguments. They did a good video actually looking at Dave Rubin and how Dave Rubin compares himself to Larry King and how that didn't make any sense, because clearly we know what Dave Rubin stands for and we know what people are coming on for. And something interesting that he actually mentions here, he says, he says, he says, virtuous free expression requires confrontation, not passive reception from a comfy chair. And he basically is saying that Rubin doesn't like to challenge, which is very true. But what I've noticed is he doesn't like to challenge when he actually, doesn't disagree with them, or it's said by someone on the right. So what do I mean by that? He actually had David Frum on his show. Now, David Frum is a terrible neocon, but he's a never-Trumper. He's a never-Trumper neocon conservative. And neocon conservative is very redundant, by the way. I don't know why I said that. But he was on the Dave Rubin Report, and that was the first time I've actually seen some pushback from Dave Rubin, which is embarrassing because all of those topics were left either advocacy for somewhat left things, like more people know about Medicaid on the left than right, and different things like that, and anti-Trump stuff. So he does push back rarely, and it's always against the left or people who disagree with the right in some sort of a fashion. Now, of course, this being a right-wing outlet, someone responded to this article saying why you should keep watching the Rubin Report, and they went on blah 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 blah. I don't really want to get into that one because we already know what kind of garbage it's going to say. But this is interesting. Let me know your thoughts on this down below. Definitely a conservative website, and what seems to definitely be a conservative unsubscribing from the Rubin Report.